Hello there, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Fired Up. My name is Morgan McClintic, and today I'm joined by the whole gang. So that's Nicole Pytel.
Hey, everybody. Hey, Morgan.
Chris Ulbrich.
Hey there.
And Ian Lipner.
Hello.
So today we've got a slightly different format. We thought we would take a number of the news stories that are out there at the moment and just sort of break them down and get our opinion, because if you haven't noticed, there's a lot of news going on. So it's an exciting time. Normally this time of year, everyone sort of packs out their announcements. So let's just take a little look at what's happening. And top of the show here is the Omnicom IPG merger, which was announced recently. These are two major advertising and PR organizations going to create a $25 billion organization. They are part of the top 5 holding companies in the world. Interpublic has a whole load of different PR agencies. Let me just make sure I get the right ones. Oh, yeah. Weber Shandwick, Golin, Current Global, which is one that they grew internally. And then Omnicom also has Fleischmann, Hillard, Ketchum, Porter Novelli. So those are major PR agencies on their own. This is going to create a broader holding company that's going to take the Omnicom name. There's going to be $750 million in saving across this group. So this is about as big a news as you can get in the marketing agency sector. Just to sort of open us up, Chris, what do you think about that?
In times of stress in this industry, you tend to see the big get bigger, the small hang on, and the middle get crushed. And I suspect this is related to that phenomenon. I would actually be interested. I know that you keep your ear to the ground in the agency world, and you're really keyed into different trends in the industry. And my first thought when I heard this news was, okay, across all of these different agencies, all of their different focuses, what do we know, if anything, about the sectors that are going to be most affected? Does this reflect trends across the entire PR industry, PR marketing industry? Or is it mainly a reflection about the sort of rolling turmoil we've seen in tech?
My view was that, look, all these organizations, they're acquisitive organizations, holding companies that buy a bunch of agencies and try to sort of win larger clients. So I've actually been to Omnicom's offices in New York, and they're very sort of sumptuous boardroom. We had a small meeting around a 30-person table. So it's very glamorous compared to WPP, which is another one of these holding organizations. I think it's actually the largest one. Actually stands for Wireless Plastic Parts, I think, which is originally a company that made parts for shopping carts. Their holding office was actually not glamorous at all. So Omnicom is just a glamorous company. I think they have all struggled with competing with the tech firms, right? Typically their revenue, they've been advertising led. Their revenue had come from taking a cut of that media buying. And as Facebook and Google came up, these organizations tried to build their own technology. Then they tried to partner with Google, and it just hasn't worked. And so here you see IPG, which has tried to be looking for a deal before, cling together with Omnicom to try and get back to some kind of scale. I wouldn't be surprised if there's other further acquisitions and consolidations in the space as they try and take, like, the key story in this New York Times when it broke is they're trying to save $750 million. And what does that mean? That's people. They're just trying to take out cost from finance and the back office operations. And, you know, as it just sort of opened up, they've got duplicative brands here now in PR. So Porter Novelli, not to pick on them, there's been rumors about that brand, sort of the third string in a major organization. How long is that going to last? I would imagine you'd see some of these brands get mushed together in the same way as Fleischmann and Hillard has now got Fleischmann Hillard. And you've seen with Burson and Conan Wolf now be BCW and other.
We're thinking about big tech and its effects. Like, are they anticipating the next wave? Is this a good way to get rid of a lot of, as I said, the people who generate revenue, they're fine. Well, that's not your entry-level employees in general. That's not how we think of them. So I'm wondering, hey, how much this has to do with we need different kinds of talent going forward, and not as much of some of the things that were normally foundational in order to move up the ladder in an agency.
When you're talking about savings that large, it's sort of like Doge and the federal government, right? You're never going to get to that goal without taking big swings. So you would think that, to Morgan's point, that they must have entire business units or agencies in mind. I mean, yes, I'm sure that there will be some mandates coming down to reduce headcount by X%, but that feels like the last 20% of the problem. So it'll be very interesting to see where those cuts land. And Morgan, when you were talking, it occurred to me that when we were talking about all the different brands and sub-brands and conflict brands within an organization like that, I was just looking at some large agency, need not be named, or conglomerate that had its main brand, a conflict brand, a digital brand, an advertising brand. And I wonder to what extent the brand efficiencies that these companies realized from acquiring a bunch of individual brands with strong brand recognition and their own customer base, whether the mood now is that the benefits you get from individualized brands are less than the financial benefits you would get from agglomerating all those under one brand.
100%. I mean, you look at the other big story in Marcom sector is that Edelman has just had 5% of its people laid off, 330 people, which by any other token is a mid-size agency. Those layoffs happened across the board, all different sectors. So it's not just in tech. But in the subtext there, they had some conflicts brand, including Revere, which was their third conflict. Edelman owns also Zeno, which was its primary conflict brand, and now has sort of reached critical mass. So a good, strong agency. Revere never reached that sort of critical mass and has been folded back into the core. Sometimes they create these brands just to sort of hold a conflict, and I think Salesforce went into the Revere brand, for example. But obviously, both of these stories are linked in my mind, that AI has come in and has meant you need less people. There's a difference in what clients want, and big is not necessarily the solution for all of this stuff. Clients are now happier to work with more agile, smaller organizations that can be part of their own ecosystem to kind of solve the client's problem. And so you link those two stories together, you're just seeing big agency go through a real struggle, as you said at the beginning. The bigs are getting smaller there, but the middle gets wiped out, and it's all about smaller, more nimble, creative agencies these days.
Well, now that's interesting, actually. So I may have had it wrong, because what I said, just to hold myself to account here, is the big get bigger and the small hang on. I'm imagining a scenario where the large agencies achieve efficiency by reducing the number of individual back offices, for instance, that are feeding in. They're trying to apply a single back office across all of their business units. My assumption was you'd see fewer brands as a result, but maybe, to your point, they'll want to hang on to the individual brands and the small brand experience while somehow unifying the back office functions. And maybe that's where they'll see those efficiencies come.
Maybe. I mean, in the last recession, the big got bigger and the middle was wiped out. So the data would support that. But I think if you're seeing the biggest PR agency in Edelman decline and have their third round of cuts, that definitely signals some general, they rise with the market and fall, but that definitely signals some change. And some of that could be quite structural, I think, not just macroeconomic. So big news. Good luck to those people. Like, having done a number of acquisitions, it's all about the people and the clients. That's what you're buying. How do you keep these people happy, motivated? How do you keep the clients? How do you make this a good thing? And it's definitely a big challenge. This deal still needs to go through approval. So I think we won't close till the middle of 2025. So we're going to see a lot more on this story. Next story here, Nicole, I want to come to you about this, which is the TikTok ban. Back in April, there was a bill that went through Congress to ban TikTok, certainly to force ByteDance, the owner of TikTok, to transfer ownership to a US organization by January the 19th. because of fears that interference by the Chinese government, propaganda, etc. Now, they're not actually banning the app. They're banning Apple or internet providers or Google from distributing it. So that's the enforcement. TikTok has obviously been fighting that. Recently, the appeals court rejected an attempt to sort of get this bill overturned. We don't know what Trump is going to do when he comes in, but the deadline is the 19th. Something needs to happen. They're asking for an emergency injunction to kind of block it in the meantime. But let's just sort of assume some kind of ban is going to take place. What do you think about this, Nicole?
Yeah, I mean, obviously they're gonna throw a few more Hail Marys in there, but I think regardless of what happens, they've changed the game for video. Before TikTok, you needed fancy production, you needed a giant strategy, you needed talent, you needed all these things, and they made short-term video attainable for a lot of individuals, a lot of brands. They've lowered the production bar. You don't have to come in and bring in $20,000 worth of production crew and equipment. I'm curious to see where that will go. Will we see that on LinkedIn? Will we start seeing more short videos there? Will we start seeing more on YouTube? The format works. The platform, say what you want about it, but the format has been proven to work. And so brands are going to they should keep using it. Just if they have to do it elsewhere, they have to.
Mm-hmm. But if you open the LinkedIn app, the second tab in is video. Have you ever used that? They are trying to do more video. At the moment, it's all about the algorithm. And I think a big question here is whether ByteDance is going to you're going to sell the algorithm with this product, because it's the algorithm that is the sticky part, right? Not just the video content, because lots of brand content on LinkedIn is not a compelling experience just yet. If you're an influencer or you're a brand, I think this goes to a broader strategic issue. This particular channel might go, but also we've seen other changes in social networks. For example, lots of brands are leaving X and going elsewhere. There are other opportunities. There are other new networks coming up. What do you think about, for example, Chris, brands deciding, I've had enough of X. I'm going to go somewhere else. Should I go to BlueSky?
Right. Everyone's talking about BlueSky now, right? Millions of people have been flooding in since the election. The growth of that platform is incredible. I've been lurking there for quite a while and keeping an eye on how reporters have been adopting it. And the difference between BlueSky today and BlueSky 6 months ago is absolutely incredible. And for the first time, BlueSky is having to grapple with the problems of growth. That means they have a very distinctive culture. It's almost a counterculture attitude amongst in the DNA of that platform. It's open. It's a lot like early Twitter, but it's not, for the time being and probably the foreseeable future, a great place for brands. There are a couple reasons for that. One is that, as MIT Tech Review just documented recently, there's been a flood of impersonators coming in. This is part of the problem of growth that you have to deal with whenever you have a social platform. Scammers, grifters, hoaxers just flood in. One of the most incredible parts of the BlueSky story is how much they've accomplished with such a small team. I mean, I think the team is still in the 20s or 30s. So they don't have a team to do what Twitter used to do, which was to verify individual users. There's even one journalist on the platform who has taken it on himself to, as a public service, verify other journalists informally, right? And he makes a list of what he considered, verified, not just journalists, actually. He also verified politicians like AOC. So he keeps the list of unofficially verified users, but obviously that's not going to scale. He has a day job, and when you have millions of people coming on. So brands at the moment cannot get the equivalent of a blue check mark on Twitter. Back when the blue check mark actually meant something, our listeners may recall that at one point it was a decision fully left with the Twitter team who got a check mark, who didn't. Then when Elon bought Twitter, he said he was going to democratize the check mark and offered it to anyone who would pay up, which might have been fun, might have increased subscribership, but it pretty much lowered the value of a check mark to zero. At the moment, if you're a brand, there is no way to be on the platform and be sure no one else is going to come along and impersonate you. And that is, that's a problem that Twitter faced once Elon opened up the checkmark system. At least at the beginning, it was a problem. And BlueSky very much has that problem now. I think in a larger sense, though, the problem for brands is just the culture. It's an anti-brand culture. It's very progressive. It's very opinionated. And it's sort of like Wikipedia, sort of like Reddit. It's not a place where a brand can expect to get a positive reception. Everything's you take on a case-by-case basis, but as a rule of thumb, I would say wherever you're going, if you want to leave X, I do not think BlueSky is your next port of call. Your media program absolutely needs to be on there because a lot of reporters, given the hostility of X to journalism writ large and the way that X suppresses news content, they're moving to BlueSky because it's not just X. When Threads launched, it was almost part of their mission statement to suppress news. When you take out Threads, despite its nominally large viewership, usership, and when you take out X, there's not a lot left. So for brands, you really have to decide whether the increasing toxicity of the X experience is worth the candle for you, because there's not another obvious place to go yet.
Ian, you were early into building communities, young PR pros on Facebook. You were the first person to talk to me about RSS in 2004. So I'm interested to see what you think about this.
Chris is absolutely right that with each of these platforms, as they pop up, there's sort of the initial adopters and they form an initial culture that doesn't always stay as the culture. I mean, if you think through all of them, even Facebook was college kids being in touch with each other, right? Now it is not college kids. It's your parents and some millennials still use that because that's what they came up with. And I think when we think about, kind of zooming out on the things we've been discussing, when we think about TikTok, or we think about Snapchat, I don't think that these are permanent sort of like, this is where it's at for brands' choices. I think with each generation, there's a preferred corner and it starts out looking like an alley. And that's why it's cool, because it doesn't look like the other places. And then soon people are like, well, it'd be great if there was like some soft drinks here. And then soon all of a sudden it's commerce, right? And different kind of commerce depending on what people want, right? Information networks different than entertainment networks, right? What is the primary value that people are getting from this? I think what's concerning about TikTok is that it's culture that Americans are shaping a little or kind of, and a algorithm that is highly addictive is sort of shaping maybe more, right? And it's all to the benefit of anyone who wants to see people waste a lot of time. Sure, there are brand opportunities, but I made a ban in my house for my kids many years ago, and now we're seeing national governments ban networks that are aimed at children. And I think TikTok was aimed at children. So those children are growing up now and they're getting better at making content for their network. But until you build something better, they're going to use it.
Right. So as a brand, you have multiple channels. One of your channels could have been X, it could have been TikTok. I think the strategy here is, as we've demonstrated, it's going to change. That network could easily morph into something you don't like, or your audience isn't there. So good strategy would be to make sure that you're on some other network, diversify a bit, and gradually pull people into your sphere, the email newsletter, the blog that you can own, your podcast, or something that's more in your control, and use these as amplification outposts, and understand that they could be quite ephemeral. And at the moment, we're seeing pretty rapid change in the social media landscape, more than we've seen for a while. Some of it regulatory and some of it as a result of new owners changing the goal of that platform.
Yeah, absolutely. And such a good point to bring up, your owned channels, your email, your blog. No one's going to come along and make that uncool. Your database is what it is. People can sign up for other emails. They can choose to read those emails. You have to up your game, but the things that you can control, you need to be controlling. So we'll see what happens with all of these other networks, but I agree. They're cool. They're not cool. They're toxic. They're not toxic. Like it changes all so quickly. We always talk to clients about the basics, the foundation, your website, your email, things like that. Stick with what you can control, get that message out. And if you decide to venture onto another platform and try it out, that's great, but you've still got this well-oiled machine that you own.
I did want to just tack on, this is all quite right. And I realized listening, what you just said there, Nicole, that you can't control what the development of these social platforms. There are large forces at work. And yet one thing that occurs to me that I probably underrated in my earlier sort of rundown of BlueSky and, mentioning X is that based on what I've seen so far and what I expect to see in the future, given Elon's prominence in the new administration and how his buddies are getting integrated into roles like the AI czars. You can't control what happens on Twitter, but you still as a marketer need to make some predictions, right? You need to place your bets somewhere. And I think that despite what I described as the growing toxicity, which I think is, indisputable on the X platform as bots flood in, grifters flood in, as some quality users leave, what's left is almost by definition, less quality, more low end, soft core ads, all the things that that you don't love to have your brand associated with it. That said, the VC community is going to stick, I think, with X. The AI community is going to stick with X. If you are a startup, a tech startup, if you're trying to stay engaged with VCs, and especially if you're an AI startup, you're probably not going to do a lot of harm to your brand by being on X because you will be surrounded by your people. And it's not like nothing useful gets done on X. It's not like no good conversations happen there. They do. And in fact, the VC conversation is very much centered on X. And given all the trends we're seeing, there's every reason to think it will be. So if you want to be visible to the venture capital community, it does make sense to be there. You just need to be aware of the larger environment you're working in. Keep close tabs on it and just know what you're comfortable with. One of the things that I've noticed about my experience, I don't pay for X. That's just a matter of principle for me. So I get the unfiltered X experience. It occurs to me, though, that people who are more all in on that platform have a totally different experience of it because they can use TweetDeck, for instance. It's easier for them to curate the feeds they see. So their experience of X can be radically different from what a casual user or someone who just refuses to pay might see. If you think you are reaching an X savvy, X using community, then there's every reason to think your content is going to show up in ways that are not terrible for your brand.
Yeah, that's totally fair. So explore different networks. We just talked about video. It's on LinkedIn. It's on YouTube Shorts. The algorithm is different for YouTube Shorts. It's not TikTok, but it's still getting good visibility there. So definitely experiment with these different channels. Let's talk about another story here, which caught my eye, was a marketing organization, again, I think called Market Collective. I think they own a bunch of other agencies. It might be the new name that owns Text 100 and Byte, etc. Has done a deal with a measurement organization called Memo. Memo's a little bit different in that what they profess to do is to show attribution between people reading an article in a magazine and coming to your website, so you can kind of get that direct attribution. There have been others who have professed the same, Trendkite, etc. It tends to work very well for large brands and not very well for trade businesses or niche organizations. But the story is that they're giving up using impressions as a measurement of PR performance. And so, Ian, I wondered what you think about that.
The measurement conversation forever has been about a lack of equal data for the public relations effort in general versus our digital marketing counterparts. And to the extent that we can actually get there technologically, that would be fantastic. I mean, I would love to have numbers that I can actually trust. The problem is that each one of these platforms says with confidence, here is your number, right? And impressions, for example, that's not something that they can prove in any significant way. I mean, we used to be doing this by saying, well, you know, you could look at the subscriber numbers and how many times is this passed around, this copy passed around. This is part of the calculation, right, of a newspaper. And you're going, well, okay, the average family, there's 3 people, maybe 2 of them. And it's all just sort of this guess, right? And yet it's treated like data. And then, should one agency leave a client and then a client brings on a new agency and new agency goes, okay, here's the metrics that we were using. And then new agency plugs it into a different platform and the numbers look different. So the intention here is great. I want to see the execution follow through for the purposes of the partnership. It seems like a good marketing deal, probably, maybe a nice channel for Memo. But in general, is that really going to satisfy the larger discussion anyway, right? Because we've had conversations with folks at big companies and small companies that say, okay, well, they read it. So did that make them buy? It's like bringing them to the website still isn't going to be enough for that final conversation with the CMO or the CRO, I should say, right? So all of these things are going to continue to be sort of a melange that everybody kind of puts together on a bespoke basis for each client, right? And I don't necessarily think that it matters so much which ruler you use as much as that you use the same ruler throughout your measurement. We can argue over centimeters or inches, and we can argue, whether even it should be a volumetric flask, right? But use the same metrics across as much as possible. And to our earlier discussion, I'm not sure that's actually going to happen until the tech mega giants go, okay, here's the numbers. We'll shove those forward to you, right? We can see the actual traffic and how it's flowing. We can see how many times they searched before they actually clicked on you. And measurement really, if we're talking about it do we move the needle? That's about doing survey, doing research, market research, learning whether your brand is more recognizable than before, doing focus groups, all that kind of measurement. It's just never going to be cheap enough for the average agency or even the mid-size agency to accomplish. So they're going to turn to these easy output systems. And I just think it should be taken with a grain of salt and should be part of a longer conversation that it's consultative. It's not an easy, hey, here's how many people read it this month versus last month. We're doing better now. That's not going to ever end the conversation. So cool gauges, man. That's kind of how I feel about it.
I think that's exactly right. The holy grail of measurement is literally getting on a one-to-one attribution of, did this person read this particular article and then go on and take some positive action, presuming that is online. And no measurement tool is ever going to have those relationships inside to see the traffic for each of the publications that business wants to get. And particularly for startups and tech startups, they are going after trade publications that are not going to allow these cookies. And there's going to be all sorts of privacy issues and carve-outs there to make this kind of metric almost irrelevant. But to Ian's point, maybe that doesn't even matter as long as you're using the same ruler every time. It's wrong, but you're looking at the trend over time. So that should be the benchmark of your performance. So we impressions, which means how many people read this article, come up with whatever mechanism you want to measure it by. I think we're still going to be seeing that. I will tell you, we're still seeing average advertising cost equivalency, which was a metric that, hey, had you paid for this space, it would have cost you this. We are still in 2024 seeing agencies and brands use that metric, which has been debunked, I don't know, at least 10 years. So I think it's too early to call the impression metric dead because we're still seeing that dinosaur lumber around.
We'll have this discussion over and over again for a long time until we're just paying for every placement, which I hope will never happen in America.
No, not to. Another breaking story at the moment is that OpenAI has released, I think, in public, its Sora engine, which allows text to video curation. So you can type in any free text and it will publish a video, 2 or 3 minutes. So short, but very realistic. So, Nicole, what do you think about that? And what are the implications?
It's fascinating and terrifying all at the same time.
Yes.
So what it can do is very, very cool. And there are some nuances. If you really truly stare at the live action videos, you can tell that they're not quite right. I saw one person break it down as, it doesn't know physics. It doesn't understand how legs move and arms move and things like that. So there's that. What it's really, really good at, though, is animations and motion graphics. And I think that could potentially be a game changer for all of these explainer videos that we see. Instead of paying somebody $10,000 for a video, can you go in Sora and make it yourself? Well, we'll see. It can't do sound right now. It can just do video. So that part is very, very cool. And what it can do is cool. It looks cool. You can tell it to do anything. You can storyboard. You can give it ideas. You can ask it to make changes. You can say, I want to make a major change or I want to make a mild change. I mean, the sky is the limit. It's slightly terrifying, though, because where is it pulling from? What can be done with it? There are safeguards in place. There's all kinds of terms and conditions. And I actually saw one video where it said, no, we will not pull this in because it's copyrighted. So it knows some of that. But, I saw one expert trying to create CCTV footage, and it wasn't perfect, but it was kind of terrifying to think that some of that stuff could be faked, considering what we rely on something like that for. So my verdict is fascinating and terrifying. Both of those things.
I agree. I think you make a good point about the explainers that also, related to that is it could challenge a lot of creators that are earning their money from just doing those kinds of videos only, especially those that don't bring their own networks and they're just sort of fast at creating and don't necessarily have audiences that care that they're the ones in particular. The scarier thing is obviously the ability to create video quickly. And while quality is going to be noticeable now and probably for a while, it won't be long until quality will be higher. If we think back to maybe the OG deep fake War of the Worlds, right? It's more about immediacy, right? And imagine redoing that broadcast with the ability to just spin out hundreds and hundreds of local videos, right? Of an emergency alien invasion happening. I'm using that because it's silly, but there's a lot of worse things that you could emulate, and people aren't going to have time to kind of look at the video and think about it. If they see enough of these things happening at once, just in the same way that we see cybersecurity attacks, just use volume to create brute force. That can be done with, hey, what just happened in the world, right? And I started talking about this a few years back while working for the crisis agency, and it was all very just seemed so far in the future to the audience. But within a few weeks, our audience here is going to be trying this out for themselves. It's hard to get logged in right now. And I think everybody is going to kind of go, what do we need to do to start protecting our brand from this? Like brand safety in an age where folks can start pulling in your brand to these kinds of ideations, right? It's very concerning. So I think we're going to see probably a whole bunch of new businesses pop up that are just out there to try to keep you apprised of what's out there that might be touching your brand, what's out there that could be an active thing going on for you in terms of creating a new crisis for you. To our earlier conversation about how the networks themselves are perceived, they're going to have to, I think, accept an overhead of being one of the policers of these kinds of things and deciding on what's authentic and what isn't. We were doing that with text and not doing it well, right? To the extent that it seems like X just gave up on that, right? So I think there's a lot ahead on that. When I say X gave up on that is like we're not seeing the same kind of controls in place for content that is potentially dangerous.
Oh, no, I didn't mean to that when I was making that face, I didn't mean to disagree that X had given up on it. I was actually thinking that we're seeing a move to give up on moderation across the board with I believe it's this FCC rule. I think it's 230, which was originally implemented to give platforms the freedom to moderate content on their platforms without incurring the liability that would otherwise come with moderation, with being a publisher. The government wanted to encourage platforms to step up and moderate toxic content, illegal content especially. I mean, the worst of the worst for sure. But 230 gave platforms the ability to do that without having to worry that they were going to get sued for improperly suppressing speech. But now, because some people, especially on the right side of the aisle, feel that platforms have used this ability to suppress their views disproportionately, they're talking about getting rid of 230 altogether. And the sort of the natural effect of that would be to strongly discourage moderation to the point where most platforms become a free-for-all. And I think that you're seeing X become like that by default. When Elon champions free speech, his idea of what that looks like is looking at the state of X. That's a pretty good view of what he means by that. If 230 were to go away, I think you'd see more and more platforms move in that direction. So it's interesting that we're coming up on a moment where one natural reaction to say the government needs to regulate this space more. But if you look at the forces that are ascendant in the new administration, there are people who want to take the reins off AI regulation, which I imagine would include content moderation. So this is a real live issue right now. In fact, I believe I saw a U.S. senator talking about it on the morning news today, trying to, argue that America's parents and moral guardians want some guardrails on this technology, and that given that free speech is a priority for the new administration, his argument was you can't define it in a way that makes it impossible for platforms to deal with this worst of the worst kind of content, this most dangerous kind of content. It will be very interesting to see how that plays out.
So we're definitely bracing for a lot of deep fakes here. And as you say, that content then could proliferate on social networks, and it's sort of guarded by Section 230. And maybe there will be pushback against Section 230 for some accountability, but probably not with the new administration. I do think for startups, though, in a practical sense, what can you do with a text to video tool that can turn out 3-minute videos very quickly? We'll see probably quite a lot, right? We saw with just the images, people were just doing blog headers, and now they had a certain look, and so you can kind of see it. But maybe now for each of the content, each of your blog posts, you've got a nice video that goes along with it. There's no audio, but to sort of explain it a little bit more and make it come alive, we'll see corporate channels be filled with these, snippets as well. So it'll help us become more visual. I imagine we're going to be able to tell the style of it, as you said, Nicole, in the same way as we can tell with the images. But I think it's going to unlock quite a lot of creativity for us and reduce the cost of producing great quality video over time, which I think is exciting. So we'll certainly be experimenting with this tool as much as we can. Great. Well, listen, Nicole, Ian, Chris, thanks for your time today. Enjoyed just sort of taking this chance to sort of dive a little bit behind the news. And I hope that was useful for you all. And we look forward to speaking to you all again next week.